right. Welcome, everyone, to our second keynote. I'm going to give an introduction. I'm very, very happy to do this. Our speaker is Geher. Glenn's like the godfather, or you could say the OG, original gangster of NEEPS. He started the society 14 years ago. I remember being at HBES. I think it was at William and Mary, and I'm giving a poster, and this guy comes up and he says, I've started this society. The conference is going to be at New Paltz. You should come. And I think he gave me a flyer, and I did it, and it was the best decision ever. So Glenn, I'm ever so thankful for that. So anyway, it was his dream that got NEEPS started. So let me give you a little background on Glenn. Okay. Glenn got his BA from University of Connecticut, and he got his master's and PhD from New Hampshire. Okay. He's currently a full professor at SUNY New Paltz. He's the true example of a scholar educator. Okay. He's an award-winning teacher. He's won the State University of New York Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. He's won numerous research grants from NSF, STEP, SURE, AMP. Okay. He's a prolific, internationally recognized author. He's written books on evopsych and statistics. His books are expanding the reach of evolutionary psychology, which is really cool. He has a book on positive evolutionary psychology. And in the last talk, you heard about Darwin's roadmap to the curriculum. Those are really cool. Okay. Glenn has also written books on topics like how to be a successful psychology major. He's written about mating intelligence. And Glenn also has a ton of research publications, which if I went through all of them, he wouldn't get a chance to do his keynote. So just trust me, he has a ton of research publications. Okay. He's a great mentor, has a very, very active lab, always brings students to NEEPS. Okay. He's an internationally sought after commentator and consultant. He's given commentary on numerous topics, and he's appeared in numerous news outlets across the country and internationally. Okay. I should also point out, Glenn's also breaking new ground with his teaching. He's been doing some international teaching in China, which is really cool. Okay. Lastly, I always think about the movie Forrest Gump. Glenn's no Forrest Gump. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But there's a line in that movie that says, "That boy is a running fool." Okay, and Glenn is no fool, but Glenn is an avid runner. He runs regardless of the temperature and climate. Most recently, he ran in Las Vegas, and I think the temperature was over 113 degrees. So it's real. That's really impressive. I just had to throw that in. Okay. I really look forward to his talk. He's going to tell us about his work on positive evolutionary psychology. Glenn, we really owe you a debt of gratitude too for starting NEEPS. But anyway, join me in welcoming our second keynote speaker, Geher.
Let's see if that works. Does that work? We can see my screen? No technical difficulties is what we're shooting for here, kids. Joel, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I totally remember meeting you back then in 2008. I feel like you've just been such an extraordinary leader for the last several years. I'm so glad that you took my flyer back in 2008 when you didn't have to. For those of you who happen to catch my final talk with Hadassah about Darwin's roadmap to the curriculum, where we were talking about hurdles to evolution education, the number one is room 335 in this particular building. I'm just gonna put that out there. Oh my goodness, this is such an honor to be here, and so happy to see, I mean, these cute little avatars, but I know that they represent some extraordinary thinkers, teachers, students, and scholars. So thank you all so much for being here. So I'm going to be talking about positive evolutionary psychology, and I'll be talking about it from a sort of broad bird's eye view. So this is an idea that developed really across my career. I've been teaching about evolutionary psychology, doing research about evolutionary psychology, literally going back into the late 90s. And this movement toward what I'm calling positive evolutionary psychology really is a culmination of sort of that pathway. And so I'll be talking about that, talking about some of the research in that area and what kind of work and insights we might be able to glean moving forward using this paradigm in the future. So, and again, this does actually connect strongly with what we were just talking about with Darwin's roadmap to the curriculum. So how broadly does evolution reach? David Sloan Wilson's survey of Binghamton students back in the early 2000s, pretty much, and this is Binghamton, so if you're in SUNY, you know Binghamton is kind of pretty much an elite school within the SUNY system. And, you know, so this is really bright students. And he did a survey of, a large-scale survey of undergraduate students, including biology students and students beyond. How well do you understand evolution, and how relevant do you see evolution as being to your everyday life? And very briefly, what he found was only biology students scored high on knowledge of evolution, which means that we're graduating students regularly. 95% of our students in college in the United States are graduating without understanding evolution. And even the biology students did not report seeing evolution as relevant to their everyday lives. And, you know, a lot of this, again, goes back to David Sloan Wilson, whom I've worked with for a long time on this now. And it's such a shame because Darwin's ideas were not designed to be limited to DNA and fossils. These ideas were much bigger than that. So the idea that we're graduating people that don't understand and don't appreciate Darwin's ideas is a problem, and it gets worse. So there's two basic ideological hurdles to evolution education in this country. The one that's really well known is religious fundamentalism. The idea of creationism and the idea that an evolutionary perspective on life is incongruous with creationism. This is a problem. Here's a really interesting set of findings that speaks to what that problem looks like when it comes to evolutionary psychology. There's a study published by Ward et al. This is back when evolutionary behavioral sciences was JSEC. And this paper presented a bunch of findings from evolutionary psychological researchers. And they presented it to people from different categories. Some of them were religious fundamentalists. And half the time, the findings were presented as just findings. And half the time, they were presented as findings derived from the field of evolutionary psychology. And that when they were presented as just findings, the religious fundamentalists reported believing those findings more so than non-religious fundamentalists. When they were framed as from evolutionary psychology, the religious fundamentalists reported believing those findings less than the people in the other condition. So the second that the E word makes it out there, people who identify as religious fundamentalists will reject anything that they would otherwise accept more so than average, which I think is kind of interesting. So there's the religious fundamentalist hurdle to evolution, which is famous and which has been a problem in this country for a very long time. But the second problem that a lot of people don't know about is resistance from within the academy. So our friend Gordon Bear, who I think his avatar is sitting there in the audience right now. How you doing, Gordon? He sent out something to the NEEPS leadership folks the other day about this obituary for Richard Lewontin, who was a famous critic of evolutionary psychology. Harvard, I think he was a geologist, actually. Maybe he was a biologist. He certainly was not a psychologist. Passed away recently. You know, I don't want to disparage someone who recently passed away. I'm sure that he thought he was doing good work. I'm sure he did a lot of good work, but he was highly critical of evolutionary psych. And the New York Times obituary recently had him quoted as saying evolutionary psychology is a waste of time. And what I have here is that's way kinder than many criticisms of evolutionary psychology that are out there. I think a lot of people in this room right now know that there's been fierce hostile criticism and resistance to evolutionary psychology from within the field of academia. So it's so interesting that people outside academia really don't have a sense of this, but we, people doing this scholarship, I think generally are aware that the biggest resistance to the work that we're doing actually comes from within the halls of academia itself. So why does evolutionary psychology get a bad rap? This is something I've written about reasonably extensively. I don't want to go on too much about it. But it's partly rooted in the fact that a lot of the very high profile work in the field has been done on behavioral sex differences on topics such as mate preferences, men like this, women like this, infidelity, another volatile topic, intrasexual competition, a lot of work on homicide as it relates to mating. There's a study that I conducted with a former student of mine, Dan Gamba-Corda, where we looked very carefully at attitudes from among academics about facets of evolutionary psychology, and we found that they don't hate all of evolutionary psych. What really gets their goat is this idea of evolved behavioral sex differences, and we found that that was very true for evolved behavioral sex differences for men and for women, and even for chickens. We actually found that academics in the field of sociology and women's studies, and this is just empirical data, I'm not, just reporting the data, reported that they thought hens and roosters were different because of cultural and not biological factors. So this bias against evolved behavioral sex differences actually runs quite deep within the academy. It's considered politically incorrect, to put it very briefly. There's two problems I'd like to talk about regarding the sex differences controversy in evolutionary psychology. First of all, there is something to the biological sex difference thing. Sorry, not sorry. There are two biological sexes, and from labs across the world, many behavioral differences that map onto biological differences between the sexes have been documented for decades. I mean, this is how things are. So that's part of the reason that that's a problem. But additionally, when you look at evolutionary psychology, it's so much bigger than simply the idea that males and females evolve to behave in some ways differently from each other. It's a much bigger field than that. The idea of evolved behavioral sex differences represents only a slice of the pie. And in fact, in that study from 2010 that I cited before, when we presented people with evolutionary psych findings that were about human universals, such as fear of heights or the universal nature of emotional expression or other things like that, no one had a problem with it. So the problem really seems to be this focus on evolved behavioral sex differences seen as politically incorrect and seen as the entirety of evolutionary psychology, which is kind of a shame because especially if you've been sitting at this conference the last few days, you know that there's a ton of things beyond simply male-female differences that folks are studying and illuminating from an evolutionary perspective. So not all work in the field of evolutionary psychology is on the dark side of the human condition. And for a lot of these reasons, I started thinking about this idea of positive evolutionary psychology. Maybe it's time to be very explicit about this idea that evolutionary psychology really has potential to have an extraordinarily positive path in terms of illuminating the human experience moving forward. So the organization of the remainder of this talk, that was something of a preamble. What is positive evolutionary psychology? I'll talk pretty extensively about evolutionary mismatch in positive evolutionary psychology. It's a concept I think is really, we've just scratched the surface regarding the utility of the concept of evolutionary mismatch. A positive evolutionary psych approach to the human condition, what exactly does that look like? Then I have a couple slides that I call Shining Darwin's Light. So positive evolutionary psychology is an integration of positive psychology and evolutionary psychology. When you look at these two fields, there's a lot of parallels. Historically, both fields really emerged on the scene at about the same time in the 1990s. In 1998, Martin Seligman, highly renowned behavioral scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, he became the president of the American Psychological Association. And in that capacity, he gave his first speech. And it was really a very rogue kind of speech, a very critical speech, where he came in and he said, psychology is famous for studying the negatives. We're famous for studying anxiety, famous for studying clinical depression, famous for looking at the problems associated with human behavior and emotions and so forth. And he essentially said, we're so stuck on the negatives that we almost have an inability to really see and understand and appreciate the positives of the human psychological experience. But humans do great things. And why don't we, instead of focusing on what's bad, why don't we start thinking about what's good and then thinking about what are the factors that predict amplifying the positives in the human experience at both the individual and community levels. And so it was really a very powerful and inspirational speech, and it like immediately launched a field that we now call positive psychology. That same year is the year that David Buss first published a book titled Evolutionary Psychology. And as several people here probably know, there's a great history in the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s about a lot of like just major thinkers, people like Steven Pinker, Dalian Wilson, Cosminas and Tooby, David Buss kind of happened to converge in Boston at about the same time, largely at Harvard, and sort of worked together and developed, sort of put together a plan for what we're now calling evolutionary psychology. So these positive evolutionary psych or positive psych and evolutionary psychology really emerged at roughly the same time, and they have very much proceeded independently of one another. So these two fields have actually paid very little attention to one another. And this is in the book that I've recently published with my former student, Nicole Wedberg. We sort of spell that out in a lot of detail. But it's really one simple idea. So positive evolutionary psychology really boils down to the idea that the use of work in the evolutionary behavioral sciences to shed light on the positive features of the human experience at both the individual and the community levels. How can we use what we're doing as evolutionary behavioral scientists to advance the goals and the agenda of positive psychology, or set out by positive psychology? So here's a simple example. Randy Nesse, super great thinker, developed with Williams the idea of Darwinian medicine and Darwinian psychiatry. And he gave a talk here at New Paltz a few years ago on this idea. And he talked about understanding anxiety from an evolutionary perspective. And most people, if you have anxiety, you don't like anxiety. And people go to the doctors, and there's pills, and there's therapies, and all kinds of things. So this is the tale of the anxious professor. That was when I Googled anxious professor, I turned this guy up. And so Randy Nesse told this great anecdote from earlier in his career as a psychiatrist, where he had a patient who was a professor who said, I've got some anxiety problems, and what can you do for me? And so Nesse did what any psychiatrist would have done and prescribed him anti-anxiety medications. And he said, come back in 2 or 3 weeks. And the guy came back 2 or 3 weeks, and he said, well, how you doing? He said, well, I don't feel anxious anymore. He said, oh, okay, then it worked. He said, yeah, but I got a stack of paper this big on my desk, and I have no motivation to address it whatsoever, which is one of the things early on that got Nesse really thinking about understanding the adaptive nature of what we might consider the negative emotional experiences. Maybe anxiety evolved and is part of the human emotional experience because it is foundational in getting us to do things that will ultimately help us survive and reproduce. So maybe anxiety and the other negative emotions have some adaptive evolutionarily relevant qualities. So this is kind of an example where we can look at something that positive psychologists are looking at, trying to reduce anxiety, trying to reduce depression, but we can start thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective, because just increasing happiness is not an evolutionarily viable goal. Positive affect, which is kind of like a fancy way of saying happiness, is the product of evolution, along with the rest of our emotion systems. Our ancestors who achieved outcomes that would have, on average, increased the likelihood of survival and or reproductive success would have experienced happiness. A yummy meal, an attractive partner who expresses love for you, winning in any capacity whatsoever. I love to win, by the way. Happiness evolved to motivate us to keep doing things that would increase potential long-term reproductive success. The emotions evolved for very specific reasons. I know Dan Glass, who's in the audience here, and Mandy Guitar, when they first joined my lab in, I think, like 2011, did a really cool research project on the nuances of the evolutionary functionality of the specific emotional states, really supporting very much what Randy Nessie had to say on this particular topic. So an evolutionary take on happiness in modern times, you know, we can start thinking about how happiness is thought about these days, and we can sort of step back from an evolutionary perspective. Therapy that is simply designed to increase happiness, such as the large-scale dissemination of anti-anxiety or antidepressant drugs, might miss the point. And if you've gone through positive psychology journals extensively, as I have in putting together this particular book, you see their journals, like the Journal of Happiness Studies, totally, and not in like a bad way, but they just dismiss, ignore, and neglect the evolutionary perspective. So it's all like, how can we make people happier? What are the factors that make people happier? Without really stepping back and seeing what is happiness from this broader evolutionary perspective. Maybe everyone shouldn't be happy all the time. Maybe that's, maybe happiness really is just a proximate outcome, and it evolves for some more broader ultimate evolutionary reasons. So this is, I think, the way that evolutionary psychology can sort of really start shedding light on issues connected with positive psychology. So from what I've seen, positive psychology and evolutionary psychology can easily be friends. Of the many academic areas that are as a unit critical of the evolutionary perspective, positive psych is not really one of them. We know, like from my earlier slides, we know that there's a lot of academics who are fiercely against evolutionary psychology. You don't tend to see that among the positive psych crowds. It's really like fields that are just running sort of independently of one another. Positive psychologists might ignore evolutionary psychology, but they don't generally hate it. They could be friends. Here's my favorite image in the whole PowerPoint, right? They can be friends. Positive evolutionary psychology in a nutshell. It's using the framework of evolutionary psychology, which is simply an extension of Darwin's ideas to the human behavioral experience, to shed light on the positive aspects of our lives. Gonna change gears a little bit and talk about the specific concept of evolutionary mismatch, which is highlighted very much in our book. Evolutionary mismatch and positive evolutionary psychology. So a key to understanding how an evolutionary approach can shed light on the positives is found largely in evolutionary mismatch. And so in introducing this concept, I like to talk about the monkey house at the Bronx Zoo. And so there, if you're from the New York area, or you remember when you were a kid, the Bronx Zoo, and this was the monkey house. When I was a little kid, this was my favorite exhibit. And I remember in 2012 reading the newspaper, back when there was a newspaper, reading the newspaper, and they closed down the monkey house. And I was like, they closed down the monkey house? This is terrible. And on one hand, it was terrible because it was a great childhood memory, but on the other hand, it made tons of sense. Because if you remember the monkey house, this is a picture of it. There were cages, small cages on either side of a corridor. There were monkeys that were different species thrown in there with one another. They were not surrounded by conspecifics. They were not surrounded by large expanses of space. Instead of trees, a lot of them evolved really to live almost exclusively up in the trees. They had a couple of logs and branches and this kind of thing. It was probably a terrible experience for them, right? And eventually, zoos around the world kind of figured this out with a lot of different kinds of animals. You can't bring elephants into the United States into a zoo anymore. It turns out elephants are very much like humans in terms of long connected, important social relationships. Just putting them isolated in a zoo, it's torture. Just like solitary confinement for a human is really torture. So when there was a shift in how zoos were being dealt with, that was really very similar to this idea of evolutionary mismatch. The reason that the monkey house was closed was because people eventually figured out that these are very mismatched conditions. So let's go to Harlow, Harry Harlow, famous primatologist from California from 1960s and 70s. His most famous thing he found was that baby monkeys that are given a choice of a soft, cuddly fake mother, surrogate mother he called them, or one that had milk, were like in this terrible bind because they wanted to be near the cuddly mom, but they wanted the milk. So that's like his most famous finding. And there's a photograph of that in every single introductory psychology textbook. But his second finding was this, that a lot of those monkeys were raised in isolation to sort of exert experimental control. And the monkeys that were raised in isolation in Harlow's research were messed up. They had major emotional, social, and developmental problems as they grew up. They couldn't form friendships post-puberty. They couldn't form mateships. They didn't form appropriate reproductive bonds. They were stressed out. They showed signs of what we would call anxiety or depression. Really speaking to the fact that if you take an organism and raise it in an environment that is highly mismatched from the ancestral conditions that surrounded the evolutionary history of that organism, you're in for trouble. You're probably going to find some kind of problems. So now we can fast forward to who we are. Are modern humans living in some kind of world of constant mismatch? So a lot of this is a little bit simplistic, but a lot of times the way we think about it as evolutionary psychologists is that before the advent of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago, virtually all humans lived in small nomadic groups for their entire lives. So we evolved to live in this kind of world, and we're now living in Gather Town. Right? Think about that. We blinked and our environments changed in an evolutionary second. Mismatches abound. And it was interesting. Putting this book together kind of forced Nicole and myself to really think in detail and research in detail what are the primary mismatches that surround the human experience in the modern world. This is just a small sample. Nomadic groups can't really exist in large numbers for very practical kinds of reasons. Partly, we'll call this Dunbar's number, which is a lot of us know to be 150. Dunbar is a famous cognitive evolutionary psychologist at Oxford who showed that our social cognition really seems to be designed to be capped at understanding or knowing about 150 people. If you're a nomadic group, and you have to move everybody and everything every few weeks, you can't have 1,000 people, you can't have 10,000 people, you can't have 8 million people, right? You can't have those kind of numbers because logistical reasons alone, you can't get 1,000 people over those mountains walking 20 miles a day, including baby, including grandma, including all of your stuff. It's just logistically not feasible. So nomadic groups have these logistical constraints on their size, and our minds evolved to anticipate that. It's interesting because I teach at SUNY New Paltz. We have about 8,000 students. That's considered a relatively small school. The town of New Paltz is considered a small town with about 10,000 people. That's considered a rinky-dink small town. So we've got about 18,000 people at least floating around, and this is considered small town America. And these numbers are way off the charts compared to Dunbar's number of 150. As Joel mentioned in my introduction, in the summers, I teach in Chongqing in China. This is the most populous city in the world with more than 35 million people. And I didn't believe it until I got off the plane and drove into the city, and it was like Manhattan skyline after Manhattan skyline. Unbelievable. So this is such a huge mismatch. There's implications regarding our psychology. We encounter strangers regularly. Nomadic groups are tightly knit. You don't tend to encounter strangers with a high level of regularity. We encounter strangers every single day. We don't even think anything of it. You go to the store, you go to town, you go to school. Here's an interesting thought experiment. I once asked my evolutionary psych class. Again, this is a small school, and these were seniors in this particular class, juniors too, but mostly seniors. And I said, how many people in this classroom of 36 people do you know, have you met before? And the answer was extraordinarily small. Like most people said one or two. And that's what it's like at a relatively small school. What is it going to be like at a relatively large school? We're constantly surrounded by strangers, and all the research shows that people interact with and deal with strangers differently from how they deal with kin or how they deal with individuals with whom they have long-standing interactions. In the field of nutrition, more than 60% of the American diet is processed food. Most of the food that we eat in our country is processed, is non-natural. And we live in such a weird society now where natural foods are more expensive and harder to come by. It's like a privilege to be able to eat natural foods. That is messed up, right? And there end up being these huge like social inequality problems that sort of follow from that as well. When we went to Binghamton for NEEPS several years ago, I remember asking Mandy Guitar, who was one of the hosts, along with Laura Johnson, I said, well, where can I get some like fruits and vegetables for my hotel room? And I remember Mandy laughed at me. She said, Glenn, this is a food desert. You didn't know that? And I didn't even know what a food desert was. But the poorest places in this country have the least access to natural foods. And the health consequences associated with that are absolutely staggering. That's a huge mismatch. That's an interesting mismatch because we evolved to like foods that are high in carbohydrates, that are high in salt, that are really, that put fat on our bones because those foods were rare under conditions where drought and famine were common, which is the conditions under which our ancestors evolved. So the modern food industry is hijacking our evolved food preferences in ways that are very unhealthy for us and unnatural for us. In this country, we pay tons of money to force ourselves to exercise. Even CrossFit, which is like designed to be an evolutionarily natural kind of exercise, costs like well over $1,000 a year for a typical CrossFit kind of experience. If you go to nomadic groups across the world, you don't tend to see a lot of people that are out of shape. Rob Wolf came and gave a great talk on this on our campus several years ago and showed picture after picture of people in their 70s, nomadic groups around the world. These people are in great shape. If you're regularly walking 5, 10, 15 miles in a day, just as a matter of course, you don't need to join the gym. The fact that we can lead incredibly sedentary lives is a major evolutionary mismatch that has implications for our psychological as well as our physical health. In this country, we have compulsory education that looks nothing like what is seen in any current nomadic group. So Peter Gray at Boston College, who's probably studied this issue more than anyone else, has studied nomadic groups and education nomadic groups at all different kinds of places in the world, in South America, in South Pacific, in Africa. And one of the common themes he found is that they usually don't even have a concept of formal education. Like when he asked them, how do you educate? They're like, well, the kids just kind of get up and go out and play in mixed age groups. And that same theme was common across nomadic groups in all corners of the earth. Super interesting. So when we have problems in education, when your kid's having a problem, a very common thing is, well, this kid has ADHD, this kid has a disease, we treat it with a medical model, that kid needs pills. Boys are 8 times as likely compared to girls to be diagnosed with ADHD. In our country, we have kids sitting at desks for 8 hours straight with 30 other kids and one 30-year-old woman usually teaching them. And that's totally not how we evolved to be educated. And we don't even think about it. I mean, the great thing about this evolutionary perspective is it forces us to really think outside the box, to sort of question a lot of these things in a way that we really couldn't otherwise. And this is all to say nothing about modern communication. The more that I see things, the more I think that, or realize that modern communication methods are in so many ways the most dangerous kind of mismatched technologies that we've got. Mismatch in human communication. So communication platforms. For the lion's share of the human evolutionary experience, communication was face-to-face, and that was it. You weren't behind a screen, you weren't on a phone, you could see the person, you could hear the person's voice, you could see their face, you could see their facial expressions, you could see their bodily gestures. When I ask my students, and I do this regularly, I say, what percentage of interactions have you had in the last week that have with other people that have been non-face-to-face? Almost every single student says more than 50%. The majority of their communication these days is of the non-face-to-face variety. That's a huge evolutionary mismatch. In terms of our communication partners, under ancestral conditions in a small clan, you communicated with your kin, you communicated with people with whom you had long-standing relationships, and that was primarily it. Nowadays, we're regularly communicating with strangers. And again, all the research we know about interacting with strangers is it's different. We interact differently with strangers than with people that we know well. Just a quick sidebar on that. There's famous research in social psychology on bystander effect, that if there's someone who looks like that they need help, they're falling on the sidewalk, or they seem like they had a seizure, as the number of people around expands, people are less and less likely to help. That's if it's a stranger. If it's a family member, that effect disappears. So that is the social psychology of strangers. We did not evolve to primarily be surrounded by strangers. Further, modern communication is incredibly anonymous. So the degree of anonymity in communication these days is extraordinary. Regularly, when my son was playing Fortnite, he plays a little less now than he had been playing, but I would go into his room at night and I'd be like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm playing Fortnite. I'm like, okay, who are you playing with? And I was like, I don't know, I think this dude's in France. You know, what's his name? I don't know. You know, people are now interacting in anonymous ways, and it's so ironic that I'm sort of giving this to us here at GatherTown, right? I saw one person, and no offense to whoever this person is, I'm sure you're great, but one person had their name was anonymous, which I actually thought was kind of funny. But we don't know who we're interacting with, right? Here in GatherTown. I don't know who these people are. I'm assuming that it says David Whitman. I'm assuming that that avatar belongs to David, right? But there's a lot of opportunities for cheating and lying and treachery and all this kind of thing when our identity is hidden. Anonymity is a major recipe for problems. Classic study from Geher in 1976. This is the Halloween study. They put a little camera up and they put out a bucket with candy. And if you've ever done this, you know what you write on it is take one. And they studied two naturally occurring independent variables. One was whether the kids were in a group or not. And one was whether or not the kids had a mask on, had their facial identity hidden or not. And the very short version is, if you were in a group, you took a whole handful. And if you had a mask on, you took a whole handful. And if you were by yourself and had no mask, you took one and you walked meekly away. And Zimbardo, if you look at the work of Phil Zimbardo, he's kind of taken that theme and that finding and sort of written extensively about how those kind of anonymous conditions absolutely breed antisocial behavior. And modern communication systems, right? If you have one of these things like I do, right? We can't get away from our cell phones. We're all addicted to our cell phones, full of all this kind of mismatched communication, all of us every single day. That's problematic. And there's a lot of work by Jean Twenge recently that shows just how problematic this is. One example of how problematic this is cyberbullying. cyberbullying really results or can be thought of in terms of evolutionary mismatch, and it increases in teen depression, or corresponds to increases in teen depression. So this is a modification of a chart from Twenge's work. She showed number of episodes of depression among teenagers and as a percentage between 2009 2019, and in 2009 it was about 8% of teenagers that she studied, and if you look behind that, it was about 8%. That was pretty steady. For non-teenagers, for older adults, it was about 6-7%, and it was pretty steady. But over these years, as the use of social media increased, as the use of cell phones increased, this graph has only increased. This graph has only increased for depression. This graph has only, and again, among adolescents and young adults, it has only increased for anxiety. It has only increased for mood stability disorders, and it has only increased for suicidal ideation. If you work on a college campus like I do, you probably know that our counseling centers are considered the most under-resourced parts or departments or units on our campus. They have the same resources they had 10 years ago, but they're now dealing with this particular issue. There was a report by Comparatech that came out recently. They looked at cyberbullying across the globe. It's really a fascinating interactive report that they put together. It's web-based. But just some simple numbers. In the US in 2011, 15% of teenagers said they'd experienced cyberbullying. 2018, it was 26%. That same exact trend, of a sharp increase in that percentage over this particular time period is found in a wide variety of countries across the globe. It's not a uniquely American thing. It is now how the modern world is running, and I would say this is large-scale evolutionary mismatch. Common denominator is cell phones and social media. And I use that stuff just as much as everyone, so I'm not trying to shame anyone against using it, but I'm saying maybe we need to do this in like a super thoughtful way. These are just some examples. So when we think about a positive evolutionary psychology approach to the human condition, we can start asking questions about depression, asking questions about anxiety, asking questions about suicidal ideation, all these kinds of problems. We can start to shed light on these questions in a way that we could not do so without the evolutionary perspective. A lot of these findings relate to the concept of evolutionary mismatch. Mismatch is, I've become convinced, it's just a super powerful concept that relates to so many features of the human experience and so many of the problems that we run into. I thought that Sarah Hill's talk yesterday was absolutely elite, and it was elite for so many reasons, but partly, and this was my comment to her at the end, I'm like, this is like the worst of evolutionary mismatch, right? Like hormonal contraception is the way that she framed it. The people putting these technologies together, the doctors that are prescribing these, they're not thinking about this stuff in terms of evolutionary mismatch. In fact, most medical doctors have shown way worse of an understanding of evolutionary principles than we might possibly imagine. Randy Nesse reported that it wasn't until 2015 that the MCAT had any questions at all about evolution. And if you ask your doctor, what kind of education regarding evolution do you have from medical school, which I have asked all health professionals that I run into, the answer is usually 0 or close to 0, right? And that's what Sarah Hill was talking about yesterday. Large scale regarding hormonal birth control, large scale evolutionary mismatch had mood related effects, had physical related effects, stress related effects. And the evolutionary perspective really sort of forces you to think about it in this bigger kind of frame. And the way she put it, it's changing, this stuff's changing women, and this stuff's changing the world. And I don't think that was an overstatement whatsoever. My friend Marianne Brandon, who gave an amazing talk at the APES Symposium in 2019, sex-related technologies, right? Sex robots. These things are being made. There's technologies, there's companies around the world that are sort of putting these things together. Concurrent with that, as Marianne and others have written about extensively, rates of sex are down in the modern world in a large scale kind of way. As sex technologies become more and more realistic, with sex robots being sort of like the ultimate in realistic, that's like, we got to step back and think about that from an evolutionary perspective, right? I mean, what's that going to do? People evolve to have loving relationships, and if we somehow go in and replace that with technologies that fulfill short-term kinds of goals, we might have a problem. Elementary education. So here's a study that I conducted with Katie Gruskin, who was a student in our lab several years ago. She did an extraordinary honors thesis where she looked at features of a nomadic education or a nomadic approach to education and asked modern college students, over 300 of them, how much of this kind of experience, and it was like unstructured play, teamwork, multi-age interactions, all these different kinds of things that we tend to see in nomadic groups. How much of this did you have in your elementary education? And people who reported higher amounts of that tended to like education better and tended to succeed in education all the way up through college more by having relatively evolutionarily natural kinds of elementary educational experiences, which didn't really surprise us because, again, when you take an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Politics. This is a study that my lab did that we published several years ago in the European Journal of Social Psychology. We presented people with what we call large-scale politics and small-scale politics. For the entirety of the human experience, there's been small-scale politics, right? What I call Thanksgiving table politics. You know, I'm mad at that person. That person stabbed me in the back. I'm not talking to that person. I'm not going to talk to you if you talk to that person. Like, there's always been that kind of thing in the human experience. I see Dan Kruger's here. I've heard Dan talk about that as politics with a lowercase p, but politics with like an uppercase p, like large scale politics, like understanding climate change and how that interacts with policies that we have for our companies and how that relates to things like the Paris Accord. Under ancestral conditions, human beings did not evolve to really think about these things or have any understanding of these kinds of things. So it's no wonder that our world is such a mess. We found in that study that people were way better at sort of writing about and thinking about small-scale politics in a quick, efficient, and fluid manner compared with large-scale politics. And again, I would argue our minds did not evolve for large-scale politics. Is our world a mess politically? 1,000%, and it's partly because it's the politics we're dealing with are evolutionarily mismatched from what we evolved to anticipate. Human diet, sometimes people say that the paleo diet is almost too extreme or it gets a bad rap, but a real short version is the higher proportion that your diet is natural compared to processed foods, the healthier you're going to be. There's like no question, call it the paleo diet, call it whatever you want, but all the research shows that higher proportions of processed foods lead to all kinds of adverse health outcomes. When it comes to mental health, there's this large-scale study across the industrialized world finding that you tend to have a higher proportion of mental health problems in a population that is relatively large. So large cities have higher proportion of people with mental health issues. Smaller communities, and it's a very linear pattern, smaller communities, you tend to find a smaller proportion of people with mental health issues. And related to that is loneliness. So there's more people, or a higher proportion of lonely people, or people reporting that they're lonely in large cities. Isn't that weird? Right? You're in New York City. You've got 8 million people you could be friends with, right? But people in larger cities are significantly more likely to report loneliness. And from an evolutionary perspective, it makes total sense because we didn't evolve to be in that kind of social ecosystem. So to sort of come close to wrapping up a little bit, shining Darwin's light. So the idea of positive evolutionary psychology is to sort of get away from this idea that evolutionary psychology is controversial, is bad, studies the dark side of the human experience. This perspective has the capacity to illuminate the entirety of the human experience in positive kinds of ways. Darwin himself envisioned his ideas to extend well beyond basic biology. His ideas bear strongly on the nature of behavior, and everyone in this auditorium right now knows it. So instead of denying the evolutionary approach to human behavior, we would be wise to embrace it fully. So while the evolutionary approach has been framed as focusing on the dark, negative side of life, there's no question that this approach can help shed light on the positive aspects of the human experience. So I say that we join forces with positive psychologists. I personally like their idea of trying to amplify and cultivate the positive features of the human experience. Darwin's ideas have been shown to help us better understand such things as happiness, love, compassion, social connections, beauty, community, and more. Like, we study these things, the same things that positive psychologists are studying. And I think that we can really work together in a way that really helps advance these kinds of experiences. So positive evolutionary psychology is designed as a scholarly area that has the capacity to help us better understand humanity. So I say, let Darwin's light shine on. There's a little kapow icon for you because I like that. I want to give some thanks to my amazing co-author, Nicole Wedberg, who co-wrote this book with me and was just an extraordinary graduate student when she was here. I also want to thank the unstoppable New Paltz Evolutionary Psychology Lab. There we are at New Paltz NEEPS in 2018. That was a fun time. That was Jacqueline DeSanta who put all that reception together, by the way. And there we are again, looking slightly less silly. But we work hard and we play hard in our lab. I also want to thank NEEPS, and I just got to say, Joel gave this speech a couple years ago where he said, we are not the little society that could, we are the little society that does, and I appreciate that so much. And for people that didn't believe that we actually held the conference in a church in 2013, there's your evidence. Might be the only evolutionary psychology conference ever held in a church, but it worked out just fine. And we were drinking sodas that night, by the way. I'm just going to say this was Binghamton a few years ago. I think it was sodas. And I just added this. I want to thank my friend Hadassah, who saved my butt just before, in case you saw my technical glitches. Hadassah, thank you so much. You've been great to collaborate with. And I got to say that you and the Evolutionary Studies program at Binghamton have been super inspirational in my own experience. And of course, I'm going to end with Zuko the cat, because I just love him and I couldn't help it. So there you go. Thank you so much for coming here and for listening, and I appreciate it. And I'm more than glad to take questions. Peter. It looks like Peter's standing at the podium. Peter, maybe you need to unmute.
Glenn, can you get the slide out of there?
And Francisca, yeah, just step right up. Or is that Kathleen? Sure.
Yeah, your slide is still showing.
Kathleen, you're muted, I believe.
Sorry, I clicked the wrong thing.
All good, all good.
Talk about mismatch. I was thinking too, based on talks I've heard at NEEPS, or at least one I recall, about the difficulty of starting an evolutionary studies program.
Yeah.
And I remember at one point you came to my institution to talk about it, although unfortunately it was right around the financial crisis, so that blah, blah, blah. But I think another factor is also territoriality, because if you're talking about academics, it's not just, I think, certain people's resistance to evolutionary theory, just, you know, that's coming out of a vacuum, but so there are a lot of people who want to protect the primacy of culture on the one hand. And then I also have encountered people who feel like if you're not doing science, you don't belong there. So that territory probably, so I just wanted to put this out there that just recently we started a program called the Global 19th Century Program. And our core introductory course is called Evolution, Revolution, and the 19th Century.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, and so now at the end of my career, after trying for 20 years all kinds of things, I might actually get to teach a course in English, because I teach French, that involves evolutionary psychology, and I can arguably do it. So I guess maybe the point I want to make here is that maybe at times an evolutionary studies program might not be the way to go. But if you can get a bunch of faculty who can focus on something like the 19th century, we've got people in biology participating and people like me who've been longing to teach this, but never got a really good chance to do it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's great. I vividly remember it was 2009. I remember visiting your campus, and there was a group of maybe about 10 faculty from different disciplines, and there seemed to be interest. And it's interesting, that book that Hadassah and I were talking about before, it's not just success stories. There are failure stories. We don't have the story about your institution, but there's failure stories from, there's more failure stories than there are success stories in trying to develop these. And it sounds like sometimes these things need to be done within the confines of the details of your particular institution. So Kathleen, it sounds like that models, what's going to work best at Vassar. And so I'd say go for it. And I think that sounds great. So thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me, Glenn? That was an awesome talk. Thank you so much. I really learned all about the mismatch. I think that's a really incredibly important topic that's only going to get more and more important as society accelerates in this adoption of new technology in larger and larger cities and more processed foods.
Yeah, Peter, just take a step back. We could hear you, but I think you're a little better if you just take a step back. Just like hit the down arrow. There you go. You got it, bro.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, quick question. So about the mismatch then, I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but if a lot of our problems are mismatch problems, then we have a good idea of what the solution to those problems might look like. At least we could go backwards in time, sort of, to a simpler age, and more in the direction of, say, the Amish or something like that. But do you see any prospects for doing like those, like intervention studies or something like that?
Yeah, so let me give you an example, Peter. So I was happy to speak with you earlier in the conference, and I remember you saying that you're working in kind of the industry area. And I know David Wilson and several people he's working with are working to sort of implement systems for large organizations that sort of take these ideas seriously. So if you know David specifically, he goes into what he calls these core design principles. But one of the core things that he tries to do, and I know actually Hadassah can probably speak to this in a lot more detail than I can because she has a lot of experience with it. But if you have an organization with like 10,000 employees, something like that, create teams that are of 150. Create subunits where there's a camaraderie, where there's a downplaying of the individuation, a downplaying of anonymity, upplaying people's relationships with one another and identities with one another on a natural human scale. So, if you have a city as large as Chongqing, you need to create small sub-communities for people to actually be able to thrive, because our minds and bodies and hearts really evolve to be in those smaller scale kinds of environments. So there's a lot of ways to do it. Like you said, Peter, you can't really go back in time, but you can eat natural foods, you can exercise, anticipating what would a nomadic experience of exercise typically be like. You can form a friend group that sort of fits in with this idea of seeing the same individuals and having reciprocally altruistic relationships over and over. You can try to live closer to kin and connect with kin, call your mom, this kind of thing. There's so many implications. Reduce screen time. I honestly think that the biggest problem in the human experience, and it's just going to get worse and worse, and I already alluded to this, really has to do with screen time and phones and that kind of thing. And I feel like we need to kind of do some kind of large-scale ways of downplaying and addressing that particular issue. We need to take an evolutionary mismatch approach to that, or else, the problems that we're seeing are only going to get worse and worse. So I think that you're absolutely right. We need to force ourselves to come up with ways to sort of address those issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Then Nick, it's your microphone. Maybe I'm missing it.
Yeah, here's my microphone. I'm sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, Glenn, as a clinician, addressing mismatch is often, it is almost virtually on an individual or small unit basis. You deal with an individual, family, a couple, or maybe a group therapy. And, you're attempting to help that individual or unit adjust to the mismatch somewhere. I mean, for an individual, for example, you could, help a man deal with the fact that one of the issues is women are more competitive today. They were gatherers in the EA, but today they compete with men, so men have to adjust to that. You can teach individuals and families and groups to adjust their diets. But much of what you're saying is so important on a much larger scale that will take political action or, community action to really address the mismatch, like you were talking, before to the previous questioner. So, it's really, dealing with it as a clinician with interventions versus, getting involved, politically, even in small politics, to really make the changes that need to be made, if we're going to get somewhere, Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important and interesting angle, Nick, and I appreciate it. But for people that don't know, Nick is one of the founders of the Applied Evolutionary Psychology Society, which is sort of a spin-off of NEEPS. And Nick has been, pushing this kind of agenda of saying, let's take the evolutionary approach and really integrate it into clinical and counseling and therapeutic psychology, so that these insights can really, help people in a real immediate kind of way. And I do think that, like you're saying, that the mismatch perspective really should be very helpful in that. So thank you, Nick.
Yeah, great talk. Thank you.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Hey, Rose. You break it.
Okay.